Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the 9th Annual FAV Summit General Session. Please welcome Grayson Braulty, founder of Braulty & Company.
Hello. We get the introduction music where Marie, France, myself, and Rich, we're very happy to upgrade from the children's table to the adults table, so looking forward to this conversation. We're here to discuss national, state, and AV policy. Sorry about the echo, not sure what's going on. National and state AV policy is a really important issue, and before we dive in, I'd like to ask each guest to give a quick introduction about themselves, and we'll start with you, Ariel.
Great, thanks, Grayson. Really happy to be here. I'm Ariel Wolf. I'm a partner at Venable, which is a national firm. I'm based in Washington, D.C. In that capacity, I serve as general counsel to the Self-Driving Coalition for Safer Streets, which is an entity that's comprised of more than 15 autonomous vehicle companies across the board, passenger vehicles, trucks, last mile delivery, working to bring about the safe and swift deployment of AVs across the country, work on state and federal policy.
So Rich Steiner, Head of Policy and Communications at GADIC. So we focus exclusively on middle mile, short haul, B2B logistics with our fleet of autonomous box trucks, class 3 to class 6. I spoke earlier up here today, so thanks for listening to me again. I hope I'm not going to bore you.
Yeah, you're not boring, never. Marie France Lauren, I'm with Stantec Generation AV. We are the innovation arm of Stantec, and all we do is focus on autonomous vehicle on all different levels. And we have a strong policy team that is supporting the initiative of what we're doing to make sure that we work towards the policy out there and that we accelerate deployment of autonomous vehicle.
Good afternoon. My name is Brad Thoburn. I'm the Assistant Secretary for Strategic Development at Florida Department of Transportation. I probably don't need to explain FDOT to you, but strategic development covers statewide planning and our modal offices. So while the department is well known for some of the major highways and bridges throughout the state, we also have offices that cover transit, seaports, airports, spaceports, and freight and rail. So that's under my purview, as well as innovation and research. And so obviously in that realm, very interested in the AV space.
Hi, I'm Mark Scribner, and it's good to be here with all of you. I work at Reason Foundation as Senior Transportation Policy Analyst. Reason Foundation is a nonprofit research and education organization with a free market perspective that has a long history in transportation policy, due mainly to my colleague sitting next to me. And I have been working on automated vehicle policy at the federal and state levels for the last decade or so.
I'm Bob Poole. I'm the Director of Transportation Policy at Reason Foundation. I have almost 3 decades of hands-on transportation policy experience, focusing primarily on highways, highway finance, and the challenges of adapting the highway system to the 21st century. And we had a very interesting session and one of the breakouts, which I think we can recap a few pieces of in this session.
And so we're focused on policy. Policy plays an absolute critical role in the future of autonomy. Without the right policy, we can't deploy. Without the right policy, you can't commercialize your product. Without the right policy, you can't pick up goods at ports. So to kick this off, Ariel, what is the current state of autonomous vehicle policy from a federal level?
Thanks. So from a policy perspective, on the federal side, I would say it's a little bit discombobulated. The reality is, when it comes to a single federal framework, that's the goal. As folks may know, there's, I would say, joint jurisdiction between the federal and local, state and local jurisdictions over the regulation of motor vehicles. So at the federal perspective, design, construction, and performance, what we have seen is a lot of effort put into autonomous vehicles and a framework there, whether it's federal motor vehicle safety standard work, research, but we haven't seen a lot that's moving forward towards the finish line. And I think that's been a little bit of a point of frustration. It's not for lack of effort, but we need to see results. I would just say one thing there at the federal level that I think is important to note. There's a lot of talk about a single federal framework as being important to prevent a patchwork of state laws. That's, of course, very important. What's more important than a federal framework is the right federal framework. And I think we have to focus on that point because as we talk about it, we're involved in Congress, negotiating legislation there, and on the regulatory side as well. But you have to get it right. Any federal framework won't do. It has to be the right one that provides for the safe and swift deployment of fully autonomous vehicles.
Mark, could you chime in, please?
Yeah, and to use what Ariel just said as a jump-off point, I think an explicit example, something we've seen in Congress in the past proposals in the AV Start and Self-Drive Acts, the kind of thing we should be avoiding is an arbitrary bifurcation between heavy-duty and light-duty vehicles. So those bills in previous Congress had said, well, create this regulatory framework for AVs, but it's only going to apply to vehicles under 10,000 pounds. There was no safety basis for doing that, or arguably there's a safety basis against doing that. But those are the types of things we should be avoiding. And as Ariel said, getting the right federal framework in place is much more important than getting a federal framework in place.
Brad, why don't the feds just call up Florida and say, look, we're creating jobs, we're doing it right. You're setting the framework here.
Well, I'm not going to argue with that. I do think, I mean, the reality is there's going to be that push and pull where you do want to have some level of federal framework, federal standards, but we do want to make sure that that whatever happens at the federal level doesn't impede the states that are trying to innovate. And I think this morning you saw one of the presentations had that, the matrix of states, and we checked all the boxes. So obviously we are, I think, setting the mark for everybody else. And so there is always that risk when you do a federal framework or federal rules that it inhibits innovation. And the states have always been laboratories for innovation. You don't want to lose that.
The proof is in the pudding. Companies are flocking here. Argo's operating in Miami. They're going to commercialize their service in 2022. More companies are coming here. So Florida's doing it right. If you look at another state, talk about laboratories of democracy, Rich, you pulled the driver, you're operating in Arkansas with Walmart. What are the AV laws like in Arkansas? Did the Walton family just call up the governor and say, hey, we're Walmart and we need to operate?
So before I answer the question, I'll just sort of flag something slightly different about our use case, which is important within the context of this discussion. So whereas many companies in the space, the AV space, are operating long haul, so required to traverse state lines, GADIC with our mile use case operating short haul B2B logistics, we are typically operating intrastate, right? However, just to build on some of the comments made before around the federal landscape, because this is really critical, that we anticipate a time, there will necessarily be a time in which we're operating a hub and spoke model for one of our customers, and that straddles state boundary lines. So I'm just sort of joining the party here and saying, moving towards working towards a consistent, safe, quick deployment of legislation across the national level is absolutely critical. And coming back to your question around Arkansas, so we worked very closely with the legislature there to ensure that well-structured, permissive, and progressive legislation was in place for the safe deployment of our AVs. And hand in glove with that is also a very robust working relationship with the Arkansas State Highway Commission, to whom we are transparent, accountable, and report on every aspect of our operations. And that's been absolutely critical, right? So you mentioned our fully driverless deployment with Walmart. So this didn't happen overnight. We began commercial operations with Walmart July of 2019, and we actually got to the point where we removed the safety driver from the vehicle in August of 2021. And throughout this whole time, working very, very closely to share data on every single aspect of operations with state authorities, local as well, comprehensive local stakeholder engagement program as well, to ensure that everybody is closely knit with these operations.
There is a gentleman by the name of Mike Moon in Missouri. He decides he wants to run for the state senate. And the guy starts throwing grenades out and has no idea what he's doing, but he thinks he can raise money and get elected and become a state senator. How do we stop issues like that from derailing an industry that will create jobs and have a positive economic impact on the communities that they operate in. You want to take that, Ariel? Bob?
Sure. Well, we find over the past 4 or 5 years, we've encountered on occasion the certain ideas from policymakers and lawmakers that don't quite fit the bill for the deployment of AVs. The way we approach it, you have to take a holistic approach and look at the situation. The reality is there's tremendous momentum behind this technology. Now, we all know the story, 2016, 2017, a lot of momentum, a lot of promise. But today there still is, and there's growing momentum for the technology. So at the state level, as an industry, as a coalition, we have the confidence to know that when we go to a state, we can talk forthrightly about the benefits that the technology brings, whether that's so obviously with respect to safety across the use cases, or access to mobility, sustainability, and so forth, that where there's a policymaker that has a different idea of where it's going, you start with education, you start with bringing the technology and bringing the arguments directly to those folks, and then you just go out and, as we've had to do, and just play old-fashioned political ball in the states if you have to. Now, we're fortunate to have states like Florida and the Sun Belt and others across the country that we've been able to run model legislation that really provides for that holistic process and path to deployment for the technology.
Ray Franz, you're on the ground. You're talking to companies in Canada, Europe, the United States. What type of momentum are you seeing?
I think that if we're looking to have a federal kind of umbrella policy on all AV technology, I think that one of the key elements, on top of what Ariel just mentioned, is sharing the information. If Florida is a leader in AV technology and AV deployment, Florida should be front and center on everything to showcase what they're doing and really talk about the success, not be scared about talking about what didn't work well the first time. Because the one thing I really don't like when I go to conferences is everyone is just saying how great and amazing they are, but we all learn from our mistakes, and it's really important to highlight those mistakes to make sure that we don't repeat it. So by sharing, you share the best practices, you share the misstep, you share how you can reach another level. Stop doing the same thing, A, B again. Try to do something else, something new, but sharing. That's really my key message. The education will take a part of all that, and sharing those deployment and those experience will really take it to another level and help leverage up everything that is being done in AV technology.
I'd just like to add, I think, argument, once we have a little more progress in a few of the leading edge states, I think we can make an economic competitiveness argument to the states that are lagging, saying, look, you're going to be lagging way behind in terms of attracting industry, having efficient logistics and so forth. If you don't learn from these guys how to advance into the 21st century mobility that this country needs.
Let me just say one other thing. I agree with everything that's been said here, but there's an additional element here, particularly when we're talking about the state at the state level and encountering and at times combating ideas that don't fit with the deployment of AVs. And that's just misinformation and starting to correct the record. Take jobs, for example. That's coming up more and more. The deployment of AVs has an impact on jobs. The presumption is that it's negative. The reality is that's not the case. US DOT has done a study on long-haul trucking in particular. We've got a driver shortage that's going to grow the number of jobs. Or take liability. The current liability regime that we have in the states can more than accommodate the inclusion and incorporation and deployment of new technologies. We've been doing it for decades. So when those types of issues are brought up, the reality is they're red herrings for moving forward on AV technology. So we have to address it at all these fronts. We have to get at those issues that are being brought up in kind of in the wrong way.
Mark, what happens when a state legislator and a state governor says, I don't care, you could have the best technology in the world, but my political interests say no?
Well, you absolutely have some folks out there who are hostile to the technology for some of the reasons that Ariel laid out, those red herrings. But I think it's also important to note sometimes it's not hostility. Sometimes it is. It's a lack of education on some of these issues. Probably my favorite example was early on in all of this in 2012 in Washington, D.C., where I live. We have a council member who's still there who got a test ride, really liked it. And because that was a hybrid electric vehicle, she said, okay, well, we're going to assume that these are all that uses this type of powertrain. And then because it's not paying the fuel tax, we're going to create a new special vehicle miles traveled tax to levy on AVs. And she was trying to be very helpful in thinking through some of these issues, but it turned out not to be so helpful, and she fortunately reversed on those types of issues. So you've got to look out for that kind of hostility, but also that kind of lack of education on these issues from well-meaning officials.
So you open the VMT door, I'm going through the door. The privacy concerns. Has anybody thought through the privacy concerns of the vehicle miles traveled?
Yeah, we have done a lot of work on that. So Reason Foundation was a founding member of the Mileage-Based User Fee Alliance, and our boss, Adrian Moore, who was here earlier today, is the Director of Communications for AMBUFA, as it's affectionately called. The privacy issue is being addressed in the state pilot projects that Congress has graciously funded over the last decade. And they found that, first of all, you need a strong privacy provision that safeguards the information. But in addition, to build confidence among the people who are participating as test participants in having their miles being reported, almost every state that's done this has hires one or more private technology companies to manage the process of reporting the miles. So the drivers aren't reporting their miles to any state government agency. They're not reporting people think this is going to be Big Brother in their car that reports every detail of when and where they went. And that's certainly not what's happening in the pilots. The only thing that gets reported is the total miles driven. And that is very reassuring to people that it's not what they feared it would be. And the surveys of people before and after 6 months or a year participating in the pilot program shows they really get it after a year or so of having seeing also that it's not a new tax, that it's instead of the gas tax, the state gas tax that they're paying. It's a state vehicle miles travel charge, and it turns around the opinion pretty dramatically by the time they finish participating in the programs.
And not just the participants that Bob mentioned, which they've done surveys and they're satisfied with the privacy protections, which are very robust, but also the professional civil liberties advocacy organizations who are watchdogs on these kinds of issues. Once they see that these data retention requirements, warrant requirements, all of these things are clearly laid out, they are much less concerned about this technology.
So, Rich, I'm sorry I got to use Gatic here. So let's say Gatic operates X thousands of miles, and they have to report their miles, and all suddenly there's a budget shortfall. You get a phone call, hey, okay, $10 a mile you owe us in a tax. How do you deal with that issue?
So, I mean, I guess I would come back to the fact that, and I mentioned this on a panel earlier today, over the number of years that I've been working at GATIC, there's been a great sea change, I think, amongst regulators, policymakers, legislators who have maybe been less open to autonomous vehicle policy and introducing autonomous vehicles into the landscape. And we're now having people actively approach us and say, okay, right, so middle mile use case, structured autonomy, point to point, safety first, understanding the benefits and so on. And I would bring this back to some of the points already made around transparency, accountability, sharing as well. I mean, this is absolutely critical if we're to move towards a point where, we're to see that federal legislative landscape and to start to remove the fear across the board in what AVs are capable of achieving. It is about that transparent and accountable approach. And so that is where we would begin. To get back to your question, we would be completely transparent, open, and accountable about everything that we are doing in terms of our operational aspects. And to date, that's been, absolutely the most advantageous approach that we possibly could have taken.
When you look at transparency, you look at honesty, you look at misinformation. He knows where I'm going with this. Dean, you know where I'm going with this. There's a big confusion between ADAS and autonomy. Marie Francis is coming your way. How do we educate the public, the industry, the policymakers that an advanced driver assistance system is not self-driving, but an autonomous vehicle is? How do we get over that? To me, that's one of the biggest hurdles facing this industry. Marie France.
I agree with you. It's one of the biggest hurdle in what we are doing because it creates that confusion and really creates that noise in the market where people don't know where to turn when they think of AV technology. One of the things is first to be patient with them. Some people are not well versed in AV technology, so be patient, explain to them. But it's funny because during the break I was giving that example that I work with the Parliament in Ottawa on autonomous vehicle. There was a standing committee that was talking about autonomous vehicle, and when I came to them 3 years ago, sorry, not 3 years, I'm losing track of time, but it was 2017, and they were about to release a report on autonomous vehicle and their recommendation on autonomous vehicle technology deployed in Canada. And when I talked with the senators there that are not as well versed as your senator here, but they didn't know that there was autonomous vehicle shuttles, and they were thinking only about AV Tesla. And I really had to take a step back, calm down, go back to them and explain to them all the different, and it's really about being out there, not being shy to talk about it, not being shy to explain to them. I mean, AV technology, if you have to live and breathe it, if you if you just close your eyes too quick or too slow, you might miss a big part of AV technology. So this is really what I do when I wake up in the morning and what I dream of at night. So you really need just to have people like us that are really interested in autonomous and learning more about autonomous vehicle technology on all different aspects to make sure that you stay on track with that.
And Brad, from an FDOT perspective, how do you deal with that from an education perspective, or when the constituents are saying that, oh, I have a self-driving car, how do you get through that big hurdle when you know, no, you don't?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, we do, whenever we talk, and we're out talking about, you know, the Florida Transportation Plan, our long-range planning, our near-term planning, and our policies, we like to, you know, I always like to kind of take that step back. I mean, autonomous, everybody is focused on the long term. When are we going to be able to take the driver out of the car or the steering wheel out of the car? And it's like, you just got to remind folks that, you know, that this technology, first of all, whether it's connected or automated vehicles or autonomous vehicles or the ADAS, that, you know, we have huge issues with safety, and there's just such a tremendous opportunity to save lives well before we take the steering wheel out of a car. So we kind of pivot to the safety aspects of it, because it's really, really phenomenal what we could do. And then also we have to be thinking about, you know, I think Senator Brand has talked about, you know, how do we plan for infrastructure around the evolving technology? And so that's where we kind of pivot our conversation. You know, we could talk 15 years, or we can figure out hypothetically a scenario when we get to level 5 autonomy, but the reality is we're planning for each phase along the way, and so that's that conversation we can have with our constituency.
Grayson, I think one problem is the terminology. I mean, you have Tesla saying full self-driving when it's not, and you have all the different vehicle manufacturers using different terms to describe various features. SAE and the auto industry ought to get together and really define common terminology, just as we have for levels of for automation. And that hasn't happened. I don't see any sign of it happening.
So there's an issue with a sitting U.S. senator, a magazine that will remain anonymous. They invited him for a ride in a quote-unquote self-driving car around a test track, and the car didn't do very well. And then he decides to go bonkers and try and outlaw this technology. How do you deal with a situation like that? We have a U.S. senator who's being told misinformation around this technology, that thinks that an ADAS vehicle is a self-driving vehicle. The magazine that's doing this is a credible magazine to most. Ariel?
Well, first I'll take a step back and not speak to any specific situation involving any particular U.S. senator. But what I will say, is this: you have to break down the problem in a couple of different ways. One is folks, the public, who are, they're focused on other things, Monday Night Football and other types of, their jobs, and occasionally pick up little bits and pieces about self-driving cars or whatever, and the kinds of confusing terminology that's out there that Bob was talking about and others, that has to get cleaned up. That's on industry. We have to work on that. We have to draw clear lines, and it's an evolution. I think ADAS AV was not a great set of letters to use, and that's and so now we have to clean that up. Driver assist and autonomous vehicles. Not fully autonomous vehicles and not advanced driver assist. We've got to really be clear about what we're talking about. Is there a human in the loop or not? And that's part one. But I will go a little bit farther, Grayson, and say this. When it comes to, in certain contexts with certain policymakers, I think the reality is that when we think about some of the stakeholders that I think stand to benefit, or at least have an interest in advancing some of this confusion to bring about or to slow down the deployment of AVs, I think there are folks that know better. And those are two different problems. One is a confused public, and one is, I think, in certain contexts, not with lawmakers or policymakers per se, but with some stakeholders, weaponizing the confusion to slow down the deployment. That's a real problem. That has to be combated in other ways, and in public policy contexts, and that's what some of us do in DC, and what we're working on every single day. So you got to tackle it from a couple of different approaches.
Why don't you're very good at this, get together with a group of individuals to say, Dear Governor Newsom, open the port of Long Beach, open the port of San Pedro, open the port of LA. Kids want their Christmas gifts. Don't be the Grinch.
That's a good message. I think we just leave it there. Don't be the Grinch. Look, California prohibits, and this is a great point of contrast, FDOT, right, and California. California prohibits, bright line, no testing or deployment of any kind involving AV technology on vehicles 10,001 pounds or more. Historically, we don't need, who cares why we're at this point, but we've got a supply chain crisis right now, and it can be addressed by resolving that. So we have an initiative, the California Alliance for Freight Innovation, that we brought together a huge group of stakeholders to try and resolve this otherwise intractable problem and bring a lot of pressure to bear on that exact issue. The reality is they've looked at all sorts of the executive order there. They've looked at a whole host of things that could work, but autonomous vehicle technology in trucking can really help address a driver shortage, which is acute and growing, and start to, as we think about not just immediate solutions, near-term solutions and long-term solutions to a supply chain crisis that's really growing in its severity, why would we not try that? And so we're working on that, and we're excited about that initiative, and hopefully it'll bear some fruit soon.
I would like to add to that, if you want your Polly Pocket, I can import them from Canada. We have them in Canada. But what I want to add to that is that, yes, there is a crisis right now, and we have a solution that could be viable right now. So why waiting? Why don't we just go with the safety assessment, with the ODD risk assessment, and use that as an emergency test that needs to be done, and then learn from that and grow it exponentially everywhere? So you take one port, one of the three that you name, but the one that is the most innovative. You take the technology that is available right there, right now. You do the ODD risk assessment, you get a success out of it, and then you move to the next port, and then the other port. But waiting always for the policy to be formalized, that's where you really miss that opportunity to show that it can really ease an emergency situation really quickly.
Yeah, and I think these are low-risk operations, drayage trucking in ports, where a big problem with that has been that we have truckers sitting in line for hours and hours, burning through their hours of service, and then having to go off duty because of that, just because they're sitting there. This can solve a lot of problems. It presents very little risk compared to some of the more advanced highway operations, and it ought to be a no-brainer.
Brad, I was at a port the other day, and I was so proud to see these container ships coming into the state of Florida getting unloaded. So bravo, state of Florida.
We've got capacity, and we've got the supply chain figured out here. But no, I mean, in all seriousness, so the supply chains are complex and hard to unwind, and they're used to doing things the way they've done for decades. And so, but at the end of the day, necessity is the mother of innovation, and I do think we need to strike while the iron's hot. And I think Florida's, obviously going to be more open to innovation in freight and in our ports, and so it's a real opportunity for us.
Could you touch on the Florida Equipment Code exemption that you worked on?
Excuse
The
me?
Florida Code exemption. Could you touch on that?
The,
The Equipment Code exemption?
I'm not sure I understood.
Oh,
what you said.
we'll
I'm
skip that.
sorry.
That's okay. We'll delete that out of the video. So the most important question, Rich, when's GATTEC coming to Florida?
Well, I'm glad you asked. So, I mean, simply put, as soon as possible, right? We're laser focused on customer needs. We always have been. A little bit about us, not to sound too self-serving, but we've never done we've never done delivery that didn't generate revenue. So we're intensely customer focused. We've got a number of interesting customer conversations going on. But if anyone else wants to have some with me, then come find me afterwards.
So Q1 next year?
Let's see.
Okay, well, we're going to welcome you to Florida. Senator Brandis will get you here. He gets a lot of people here. Bob, we talked a lot about AVs, but you were telling me about EVs. You can't charge on a highway. Why? Talk about that, please.
Right. It's illegal. It has been illegal since 1960 to offer any commercial services at interstate rest areas. Unlike the turnpikes in this country, which all have diverse large-scale service plazas that you can buy meals at and buy souvenirs and get directions and do all kinds of things. That happened in 1960 because the interstates were bypassing small towns, and the business of the merchants, gas stations and motels, were figured they were going to go out of business. So Congress said, okay, you can relocate to the off-ramps, but we'll prohibit any service plazas on the 90% of the interstates that are not grandfathered toll roads. So that is now a barrier. It's a huge hole in the bipartisan infrastructure bill that was just passed, signed by the president, that puts $7.5 billion into EV charging, but not on the interstates where it's really needed for long-haul travel. Now, lots of it, we need chargers in urban areas, of course, but if electric vehicles, including freight vehicles, are going to become the norm, we really need to deal with the long-haul rural interstates where you can't recharge. People are not going to buy cars or trucks to do those long-haul routes. So Congress actually had a provision in the House reauthorization bill, but that bill got scrapped in favor of doing the Senate bill, and the coalition that got started to try to put the EV charging, get an EV charging exception into the law, failed to convince them to put it into the bipartisan bill, and so far has failed to get it into the big, now called the Build Back Better bill. There's still some possibility that maybe that could be added in the Senate, but state DOTs that want to do this haven't gained enough traction, or the EV community to really get the message across.
Rich, as GATTEC scales, what are you the most concerned about from a policy perspective? Are there certain landmines that you're trying to avoid or certain obstacles? Because I want to point out you're operating not just in the United States, you're also operating in Canada. There's certain things you can do in Canada that you can't do in America and vice versa?
Yeah, great question. So just to paint the picture here, we're live in Ontario, Canada, also Louisiana, Arkansas, and 2 deployment sites in Texas. I think from our perspective, and this is a challenge, it's a good challenge that all of us in the space face, it's being able to scale quickly enough to meet customer demand, right? It has been a very, very busy last couple of years. We've talked about the supply chain challenges. As a company operating in the space, we feel privileged to be part of the solution. The customer need is great. It is there, and it is expanding. So trying to grow as quickly as we are needed to grow is it's a good problem to have. So when it comes to the policy perspective, it's ensuring that the policies, the regulations are there in states in which they are currently not, to do what we need to do, which is be able to remove the safety driver from the vehicle safely when we need to do so, and also move freight for a fee. There are some outliers in terms of the policies, amongst various states that we need to look to address. So I would say, these are things that we are actively working on, both individually as a company and also in partnership with others.
Do you run into zoning issues at all, or is that with your partners or dealing with all the zoning issues for commercial warehouses?
No zoning concerns for us.
Okay, so you just work on the vehicle side. The infrastructure side is handled by your partners.
So, could you repeat the question?
The infrastructure is handled by your partners for all the environmental concerns from picking up.
So in terms of being able to access the pickup points that we need to access, we have everything in place in terms of working with local authorities that we need to have. All of our operations involve very comprehensive stakeholder engagement plans, which have enabled us to do exactly what we need to do on that front. So it has involved a lot of work, a lot of heavy lifting at points, but it's work that we take very seriously and has enabled us to do exactly what we need to do.
So GATX scaling. Brad, autonomous vehicle companies are relocating to Florida. They're currently in the testing stage. They're getting ready to expand. Miami's a hub right now. They're coming up to Orlando. They're going to Tampa. How is FDOT preparing for the massive growth? We have the New Yorkers coming seemingly every day by the plane loads, and now soon the autonomous vehicles will be coming by the plane loads. How are you going to prepare for that?
That's a great question because we just had the census. We're getting all the population estimates, everything, and we're probably going to throw them out because the last year just sort of kind of turned everything on its head. So anyway, it is a real. We did see an influx of migration to Florida. One of the things we are trying to we're gonna really have to assess is where that population moved to. In sort of the urban, suburban, even rural context, and what that means for travel patterns, because we do see a migration away from during COVID, away from the urban core a little bit into suburban areas, and even kind of leapfrogging. And I think one of the issues we're going to have to deal with is the fact that, with remote work, it creates flexibility for people to live in different places. And you may see some of these smaller rural cities that may not be too far from urban centers become magnets, and, because I could work from home, live on Plaquemine River, live on the river in Plaquemine and St. John's River, So those are the kind of things we're going to be kind of assessing as we look at the demographic data over the next couple of years. And we're probably going to have to be planning for a couple different scenarios in that regard.
And Marie-France, you work with companies to plan their AV deployments. How does that change when, say, customer A calls you up, say, okay, we're going to go out and deploy in the suburbs. Oh, wait, we want to come back to the urban core. How does that change from a planning perspective?
Yeah, a really good question, because believe it or not, I still have some clients that think that you just put the autonomous vehicle there and push start and it works. I really had a hard time to burst their bubble and say, no, that's not how it works, so you need to plan ahead. Some of the things that you mentioned earlier, you said about the planning as it goes, but you really need to have that vision of where you want to be in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years from now. And then you can take, when you think of AV, a lot of people think of like a gigantic elephant. You can eat the elephant, but you need to have like a little bite every day. You can't eat the entire elephant in 1 year. So if you say that you want to be ready in 5 years, there's so many things that you can start doing right now on the planning side, and just see like what is feasible, where you want to be, how you want to do it. What's the technology available right now? What's the technology that we think will be available in 2 years, 3 years from now? You need to have that intel, like that secret agent intel that tells you that in 2 years, that company is thinking of moving from just moving goods to moving people, or the drones company will think of moving people with the drone, or moving containers with drones. So it's all those kind of information that you need to have in your head and in your plan. So when you plan ahead, you eat that elephant bite by bite, and at the end of the day, in 10 years from now, you can be fully autonomous, and you won't have like a big hole in your budget.
Yeah, and I'll say that, like, from a planning perspective, clearly the development of new technologies and emerging mobility solutions and sort of the disruptive forces are really challenging from a planning perspective. We do 20-year plans, and remember back in 2015, MPOs were doing their long-range plans, and in 2016 they realized they didn't take into account TNCs, and they're like scrambling to figure out what's and it just kind of goes to show that you have to be able to anticipate, but also kind of differentiate between the marketing hype versus what's really happening out there. But you also know that technology kind of doesn't progress linear. It ramps up. It's kind of bumpy based on new developments along the way, and then things sort of take off. And so it makes it challenging. You have to really do scenario planning where you anticipate potential different, adoptions of new technology, how the public might react to it. And so you need to, it forces us to be a little more nimble and agile in our planning.
And I just want to add to that, that also when you think of AV technology, you need to think of it as one solution of mobility that has to be included in a mobility plan. So everyone knows that I hate silos. AV is not one silo. It has to go through everything and all the different options. And it's just like one of the ingredients of that cocktail of solution that really characterize the mobility of tomorrow.
Brad, are your planning cycles getting shorter and shorter now since there's all these new technologies coming online?
Well, we use different techniques. So we still have a 5-year work program. We do a long-range plan. Our MPOs do long-range transportation plans. We do the Florida Transportation Plan is a long-range vision. But what we do now is more sort of that gut check, performance reviews on a regular basis. And so we sort of build in sort of these cyclical processes so that we're always sort of reevaluating things. So if a Florida transportation plan, a statewide transportation plan, is updated every 5 years, but we don't put it on the shelf. We have an implementation committee. We do annual performance evaluations. And so we kind of put processes in place that force us to always be thinking about the context of where we are in mobility.
Mark, looking to the future mobility, you're studying this stuff. What new trends do you see emerging over the next 5 to 10 years in mobility?
Well, I think right now the big question is what is the, sort of the future of shared passenger transportation? COVID was something we didn't see coming, and in many parts of the country, we haven't seen that rebound. So I think you've seen, understandably, a shift toward freight operations, both the kind of the smaller delivery vehicles, as well as certain things like GATIC, middle mile. But also, we'll see if this latest supply chain crisis, which is more fallout from the pandemic, spurs some new interest, investment in those kinds of drayage operations in ports, better integration, I think, not just with road vehicles, but with rail, freight rail, where there's a lot of interest in automation, both in infrastructure inspection, but also in operation. And, if you can combine, say, to turn back to the supply chain issues at ports, if you could combine rail, truck, and crane to move those containers in kind of these seamless movements, that's potentially really, really game-changing. I mean, we've already seen what happens globally with automated cranes alone. When you start adding the ground transportation, both truck and rail, I think you start seeing a lot more throughput than I think anyone even realizes now.
Then you get a very stable supply chain. Ariel, from a policy perspective, will there be supply chain issues around policy as the automation starts to go from the vehicle into the trains? Anything that you're seeing out there?
Yeah, there's going to be, the next thing, or one of the things that needs to be tackled is port automation. Involves other interests and stakeholders, labor groups and things like that. There's historical examples and international examples that has to be tackled. Rail has started to surface as an interested stakeholder in some of the state debates that have arisen over autonomous vehicle, autonomous truck regulation. That's something that's more recent development in the sense of being active and present in those debates. So I think that's definitely part of it. One thing just, the backdrop of all of this that I think should be said is that I think there's really a tension here. Everything that's been said about the importance of planning, the importance of thinking through 5-10 years ahead, that's balanced against the urgency that I'm sure has been repeated dozens of times today. The urgency that just today there will be more than 100 people who die in the U.S. as a result of human error. And so What I don't think, I think there's a complacency that's set in the United States over the baseline we have, and so much so that now we start to see, even over the Thanksgiving weekend, at least my meal was somewhat ruined in a sense with seeing an article that was passed around, that was in the Atlantic, about how 94% figure about human error, that's not right, and we have to focus on other things like signage or fixing infrastructure and things like that. That really, it's not, the human error is not the problem. That's a big problem to have that kind of argument being put forward, and it starts to deteriorate the urgency that we're working so hard to push back on. And so I think in that sense, we have to find a way to balance those things. We've got to get the technology deployed. We have to stop, there's a lot of naysayers out there. We have to stop finding ways and reasons to prevent and slow down, but while at the same time, plan appropriately. And I think the solution to that, Grayson, is to focus on the small ball. What's not going to happen is a big, anytime soon, I'll share, we're not going to have a big signing ceremony, ribbon cutting ceremony for federal legislation with everyone gathered around in the Oval Office or whatever it is. I hope that's true. But in the meantime, between now and then, we have to be doing things like small provisions in the infrastructure bill, or working on how are we going to have an inspection regime for autonomous trucks, and instead of drivers inspecting the trucks on a daily basis. How are we going to remove certain barriers that are easier than others in the regulatory landscape at both the federal side and on the state side? So we have to, in a sense, it's on the policy approach is, it's not just walking and chewing gum, but it's like walking, chewing gum while on a unicycle and juggling. You got to push on all fronts, and that, I think, helps resolve the tension between planning right, but also dealing with the urgency.
I want to throw this out there to the group. Are we in a better shape now because electric vehicle policy is at the forefront now, Ariel, where the autonomous vehicle can kind of go behind the scenes and build relationships, and so when we surface again, we're ready to go as EVs dominate the policy headlines now?
Well, look, the reality is that AVs will help bring about the deployment of EVs because there's going to be fleet model deployment and so forth. I think it's a helpful development, but we can't join them at the hip. So it is to your question, I think it is positive in the sense that policymakers and the public, I think, do see those things, the general trends coming, and the timelines maybe, in a sense, are in parallel or converge to some extent. But I think it's not wise to link those two AVs and EVs directly together and have their fate be tied from a policy perspective. It may be great, and I know there are companies, coalition members and not, that are committing to have all their AVs be EVs, and that's a great thing. If that can be done, that's great. But from a policy perspective, we have to protect the diversity of use cases and the ability to maximize deployment, and from that perspective, we have to be careful about that.
Rich, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I do, and whilst I would agree with you, Ariel, for sure, just talking a little bit about the electric autonomous box trucks that we have live today, we don't see EV, AV as siloed. We see it as an integrated solution in which we're able to offer something quite special to our customers. So again, coming back to the use case, short haul, B2B, so given battery lifetime, as it currently stands, the types of routes that we operate on versus, say, some of the more long haul routes out there, we're able to, unload and load our vehicles whilst grabbing a charge if we need to do so. So our vehicles operating like busy bees behind the scenes. It's a very, very efficient model. It's all about efficiency, right? So in terms of what that offers to the customer, it's essentially continuous operations within our operational hours without, there really is no stopping to it. That all being said, I do agree with the need to keep, the approach to policy making somewhat separate, but I think a type of model like what we're offering with our electric fleet will bring both of those two separate policy spheres to the fore in a positive light, so they will be able to be addressed somewhat distinctly, but in a positive fashion.
No, that's really interesting, and it comes that we have to be flexible, and this has been a really, really interesting conversation, and thank everybody for coming up here to discuss this. And as we look to wrap up, I'd like to ask each person to give a closing remark. And Bob, we'll start with you, please.
Well, I just want everybody to remember that for the EV future, that's also part of the AV future. We really need to get charging on the interstate, on the 90% of the interstates where it's illegal, and I think that is doable objective within the next year or so.
Well, I would just say that no one should be particularly optimistic about leadership emerging at the federal level in the near term on automated vehicle policy. I think the near-term policy wins are going to happen in the states, and that's where we should keep our focus on, making sure we're doing the kind of information sharing on best practices that so far I think has been bearing fruit. We just got to keep at it.
You know, I didn't get to answer your question about the education of leaders. And one of the things that I think we left out is, you know, not just trying to forestall, you know, somebody coming out and being against something, but we need to continue to build champions. Senator Brandis, we've been sort of, you know, we've been lucky because we have somebody who has carried the mantle. But we need to build an army of champions in our legislature and not just be trying to educate those who may be coming against AVs or against EVs or against technology in general, because I think they're the ones that are most effective in combating some of that disinformation, because we're perceived as coming at it from, you know, maybe different reasons, and so I think that's important. And also, I think one of the things that Florida's benefited from is having great partners throughout the state at the local level. So we talk about state policy. I like to wrap in our transit agencies, our ports, our aviation facilities, and on all the modes space as well. And so we're really fortunate there.
I heard a lot of element about policy, obviously, collaboration, emergency, flexibility, agility. I would say that right now, the AV book is blank. So we are writing that book right now. And I think that all together with the policymaker, with federal, state government, municipal government, with the technology provider, with the legislator, with the policymaker, it's about doing it all together and really writing that book. So we stop scratching and rewriting next to it, but we write something that is readable for everyone, and that's how we will educate people and have that flexibility and agility coming in the future.
Maybe my closing comment will be a story, an anecdote. This is coming back to my second week at GADEC, and essentially as part of the orientation package, you of course get to experience you know, a ride autonomously in one of our trucks as soon as you come on board. So this is a long time ago, over 2 years ago, and you know, got in the truck, and you know, first 5 minutes, of course, my mind absolutely blown. Right, the truck is driving itself. After about 5 minutes, I tell everyone this, it gets quite boring quite quickly, which is exactly what you want because it is safe and structured and doing everything that it should be doing. So the message here is, and this was well over 2 years ago, this is happening now, right? So you know, we're in the wonderful state of Florida, in which there's a very progressive, permissive ecosystem for AVs. There are still some jurisdictions in which that's not the case. Let's stress that message, which I think has come out very clearly today. Let's all be part of the solution here, because we are doing that right now. So let's push this across the country. Let's go.
Well, I guess in conclusion, I would say that I'm very optimistic about the coming year, about the coming months. There's tremendous progress underway, and you know, my father's a doctor, so he's disappointed that I became a lawyer. But as a lawyer, you can say, you know, not every client necessarily is right, but this one, the industry, the facts are on our side. The arguments are on our side, and that, I think, should bring a fresh, really a push of optimism on the part of the industry. And in particular, what that means is it's not about industry versus whoever or in that arena. It's about an entire ecosystem that is built around an industry that's going to bring about tremendous positive change in society. And because of that dynamic, I think that the coming year we're going to see a lot more success, for sure in the States as we go across. You look at the Sun Belt, you look at Florida already, but in many other arenas, but at the federal level as well. There will be success there in the regulatory sense, if not in the legislative context. So stay tuned, but I'm optimistic.
Optimistic is wise. Autonomy is good for society. Autonomy will create jobs. And to our wonderful panelists, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts today.
Deep and soulful. Deep play music.
I'm ready to go. Awesome. With you. Well, you can't get rid of me this easily, and so we're back with another wonderful group of individuals, and we're going to go from policy to safety, and we're going to discuss safely deploying autonomous vehicles as we look to wrap up today. And really smart individuals, really great insight, and so I'd like to ask each panelist to kindly introduce themselves, and Corey, we'll start with you, sir.
Corey Clothier, Stantec Autonomous Mobility.
Jason Eichenholz, co-founder and CTO of Luminar Technologies.
Carter Stern, Government Affairs with Cruise, the electric autonomous vehicle company.
Megan Serjane Samples, Director of Government Relations for Lyft.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Joseph Holmes with Perrone Robotics.
So I'll kick this off by asking the million-dollar question. How safe is safe enough? Carter, we'll start with you, sir.
Sure. Well, as we heard a little bit earlier from some of the panelists on the last panel, the state of affairs on roads in America is unacceptable. Most accidents in the U.S. are caused by driver inattention, whether that's looking at a cell phone, drunk, tired, whatever the case may be. But the common factor is that human drivers are not quite up to the task of safe road operation. So as you roll out AVs, the big killer feature that AVs have is that they're not susceptible to any of those issues. Now, it requires development. Obviously, we've seen AVs take a while to get to market, and that's been the result of a slow, deliberative path that we've all taken. As AV providers, it's not in any of our interests for us to rush this to market. But as we continue to test, as the millions of miles tested pile up, we can reach a degree of certainty that these are in fact safer than a human driver. And that is the level at which we need to hold ourselves, is safer than a human driver.
Jason, what role does LiDAR play in safety?
So I think it's a lofty goal to be safer than a human driver, but unfortunately humans are, as you said, very horrible drivers. 1.3 million people lost their lives last year in automobile fatalities. In the US, When we put that in perspective, that's the equivalent of a 737 dropping out of the sky every working day. So while we're talking about deploying autonomous vehicles, let's look at that from a different perspective. Let's all imagine on Monday a Southwest jet drops out of the sky. Tuesday, United. Wednesday, Delta. Show of hands here in the room, who would be at the airport on Thursday or Friday? But we tolerate that same level of safety. And so we have a goal in using LiDAR technology, and that's really the hardest thing to develop in the AV stack and having good perception, with a goal with our proactive safety system to move towards zero accidents. That's what the kind of big thinking we need to develop to deploy autonomous vehicles. That's what we should be looking for. And it's not just autonomous vehicles, it's also in driver assistance features that people do not turn off because they don't work so well. That's the other thing that LiDAR can enable, is very effective working proactive safety systems, or ADAS systems, that don't have a problem every 8 miles down the road, according to AAA's report yesterday. We think we can solve that problem.
It's a noble problem to solve, but as a society, Megan, this is for you, why do we tolerate this?
I think we tolerate this because I didn't see any hands go up in the room about being at the airport on Thursday. And I think it's because these accidents that happen are geographically and temporally diverse. It's not going to happen to me. And if it does happen to you, it changes your life forever. And I think we've just become okay with 1.3 million deaths per year. We're okay with it. But if an autonomous vehicle gets into an accident, it'll make the front page. And I think we can do better.
It makes so I dove into the data on that, and this major international newspaper made anonymous. So I asked, I said, why do you cover the crash of autonomous vehicles? They said, do you see how much ad revenue we make of this? And it's all being driven by ad revenue. It's sad. It's not being driven by doing good for society, because if you look at it, I used to live in California, and famous people live there, and they get into a car crash, it's on TMZ, it's on every major news outlet, and that's all people talk about, and then it goes away. But all the individuals that are not on TV or not in the movies, and they lose a loved one, they get in a crash, you don't hear biddity boppity boop. It's sad. Hey, Megan, how many lives is Lyft saved? You get people that drink too much and you give them a safe ride home. How many lives has Lyft saved?
I don't have a real number on that one, but countless, and I think we have more to do. We can always be doing better, but safety is paramount to us and our number one priority. And I think the addition of autonomous vehicles on our platform just adds to that safety component that we have.
Let's say 80 per year.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Just 80,000 per year you've saved. Good job.
Thank you.
Making it up.
And so, Joseph, you're at Perone Robotics. How is Perone approaching safety?
It's a very good question. I think it's a very broad, open topic of debate, this one. But I think for us, safety kind of comes down to a couple of things. I think getting the public outreach very early on, I think, is really important. So there should be no surprises from any of the stakeholders that we are deploying an autonomous vehicle. That should be the last piece of information that is made available. The vehicle itself has to be safe. You know, the panel discussion is how to make autonomous vehicle deployment safe. The deployment has to be safe by educated stakeholders, but the vehicle itself has to be safe. So to answer your question, at Perone Robotics, we work with some of the great OEMs, Green Power for our bigger vehicle, which is an Altoona-tested vehicle, and obviously Local Motors, which have actually crash-tested their shuttle. So yeah, it's making sure that all of the pieces are connected, and yeah, having the deployment safe and having the actual vehicle safe. I think it's pretty key.
If you look at this, anybody could say it's safe. I mean, Batman could say the Batmobile's safe. Anybody could say anything they want. And we're going into your wheelhouse here, buddy. Independent third-party safety verification. Why is it important?
I think what Joseph was just talking about, the segue almost of saying safe deployment. And then also you were talking about before with the media coverage, I've been involved with accidents with autonomous vehicles and that have made headlines and that were essentially fender benders. But they were avoidable. Most of them were avoidable, if not all of them. And what we started to do and why we even got into the space of third-party verification for safety is because as we started to deploy more and more autonomous vehicles and pilots, and I think my team has deployed over 50 pilots around the world so far, is that we kept getting questions from essentially the stakeholders, but it could be the transit agencies, sometimes even the mayor, and they would just bluntly ask, how do I know this is safe? And so we could refer back to this AV supplier or the OEM and refer to their safety policies and their certification, but it still wasn't good enough. They wanted a second or a third party verification service. So we started to look at what that looked like, and we're working with a few companies now, and I think it's just really important that as we start to gain traction here and in this space, and we start to commercialize these vehicles more and more, and regulations catch up, we're going to have verifiable compliance with safety. And Grayson knows this all too well. He and I have worked on this for a few years together.
So, Carter, one of your co-founders, Kyle, recently went drive route in San Francisco. You put the videos on LinkedIn and YouTube. What had to happen in order for Kyle to go on that ride with no safety driver, no safety engineer in the vehicle?
Well, there's the engineering piece, which is, of course, years and years of work and millions of miles of on-road testing. That ride took place in California, and there was a laborious regulatory process that we had to go through, which the state of California put in place to assure them that the process was safe. And so that's the culmination of years and years of work. And of course, you build upon that foundation, and that allows more rapid deployment as time goes on. But as you could have guessed, it was a big milestone for Cruise and something we were really proud of. Beyond that, as you think about how do you measure whether or not something's safe, I think the insurance market is a really good way to think about that, right? If we can obtain insurance for these vehicles, someone who's pretty good at measuring risk has decided this vehicle is safe enough to be out on the road. I think that's a really good way to like a secondary way to measure how safe those vehicles are.
And some of the individuals, Mike Stanker, if you're in the room, you do a great job at Aon, and they understand the industry and they really take the time to learn, and that raises the whole collaboration aspect. Megan, Lyft, you sold Level 5 to Toyota's Woven Planet, and now you're just operating the Lyft platform, which you always should have been. How important is collaboration, and how important is an open platform? So if you got Quarry Robotics or Prone, they want to work on your system, talk about that, please.
Welcome. Come on, join the team. No, I think collaboration is super, super important, and we realized early on that people have to focus at what they're good at, right? And what we're really good at is managing a transportation network company and a platform. And so by inviting other partners like Argo AI and Ford to come onto our platform, they're able to focus on what they're really good at. And it allows us to really scale more quickly than anybody else probably can if they were doing this alone. So really the collaboration is super, super important to come to the table, to be able to share data and information and experiences and knowledge that we're uniquely good at. So really excited about our launch that's coming up in Miami with Argo AI, and also our partnership with Motivational that we have in Las Vegas and California as well. And it's just allowing us to get autonomous vehicles to the public quicker and safer.
When are you going to put a slot machine in the Motivational car in Vegas?
ASAP, I think they're already there.
Oh, good stuff. I signed me up for that one. Jason, Luminar's laser focused on LiDAR. We've known each other for a while. What makes Luminar Luminar?
First, thank you for the pun on the laser, twice, by the way. We were founded on this goal of making autonomous vehicles safe and ubiquitous. It's in our DNA. And we knew this was a hard problem. We knew it was the hardest problem in enabling autonomy, was providing perception. The other stuff can be done, it's somewhat linear. There's still a lot of challenges there, but being able to have high definition 3D maps of the world around you, whether it's for ground truthing, whether it's looking for curbs, whether it's looking for a child walking out between two parked cars, or enabling the Achilles heel in the industry of making an unprotected left-hand turn. You know, we knew that we had to develop a LiDAR that was better than anything out there. And that's really what we did. And we did it because we have a relentless group of engineers and team members that saw this 1.3 million live problem and took it on full force.
And I want to give you a shout out because half of your operation is based in the great state of Florida. So thank you for building great products in this state.
Yeah, and we're here for one reason. You know, I'm one of the co-founders, and we could have put it anywhere, and I wanted it here and here in Orlando. And the reason is this is where the people were. LiDAR was essentially developed here in Orlando. And so between Lockheed Martin Missile and Fire Control, Northrop Grumman Laser Systems, L3 ALST, Harris over in Melbourne, Kennedy Space Center, there's a lot of eye-safe LiDAR technology. The other thing that kind of made Luminar was we built this team. A lot of the team we built while we were still in stealth. Now, being in stealth in California, you say, I've got a company, I'm in stealth, you know, you can go hire them. Here, we didn't have a website. There was no signage on the door. That's hard to do in Florida, really hard to do in Florida, or to get people to move to Florida. But we built a team with a millennia of man and women years of experience developing LiDAR technology. And we leveraged that with people who have consumer electronics experience, whether it's Motorola or GoPro, other type consumer electronics pieces. And then the third wave of hiring are the people who come out of the automotive industry, understand what it takes to develop and deploy something into the automotive industry. And that is a challenge. So that's sort of what makes Luminar Luminar.
But you also have the Mickey Mouse package for your early employees.
Yeah, so one of the things we did is we had to get very creative on how we brought employees to Florida. It's an uphill battle, especially coming out of Silicon Valley, to get some of the top talent in the world to come here. And I have a saying, leverage the magic of the region. A lot of technology people push down on the hospitality and tourism industry here. We leveraged it. So for some of those really high potential employees that we really, really wanted, we gave them and their family for the first year Disney or annual passes as an extra bonus on top of everything else in their startup package. They were heroes in their kids' eyes.
That's what counts. Carter, I want to stay on the Disney theme. Can Mickey Mouse fit in the cruise Origin, and can he get to his destination safely around the Magic Kingdom in your vehicle?
Though testing does not confirm this, we haven't done that yet. I would believe a Mickey Mouse could fit, maybe Donald Duck. I don't know if the whole Toon Squad could, but you know, that's for the future.
Corey, what role is infrastructure going to play in enabling the deployment of safe autonomy?
None.
Well said. Well
Good
said.
answer.
Alan Kornhauser, thank you for the applause.
Was that Alan? Troublemaker. Comes all the way down to Princeton to heckle us. Nice. That's a good question, and honestly, it hasn't been determined yet. So, you know, we have a lot of smart people making good educated guesses. We're actually starting an initiative to answer that question very correctly by speaking with folks like you guys and Cruz and Perrone and to really understand what your infrastructure needs are. Because right now we've got a full spectrum of people saying, I need no changes to infrastructure. We are going to design to what's currently there, to some that need some level of cheats. They maybe need localization support. They need better signage, or make sure that the lines on the road are clear. But we have a full spectrum of AV suppliers with different answers. So, but I think there is an answer, and I think infrastructure. Why not allow infrastructure to enable safe operation of AVs in the future? But that may be a far-off future, maybe a decade or two away. Is that when we really have full penetration of autonomous vehicles, and if infrastructure can support efficient and safe operation, why not? but I don't think anybody has a real clear answer yet. I know I don't.
And I was just going to very quickly add, the last thing a city wants is for a company to come in, like Perone Robotics, and say, oh, you have those roadside units. They won't speak to our onboard unit. We need to change that out. Or, oh, you use this application for passengers to hail the vehicle or to be integrated into the system. Oh, that won't work with us. You please have to download this other platform. That's just never going to fly. So to answer your question, it has to be nothing or minimal. And I think we're verging into that when we go into the safety discussion, maybe additional LiDARs to help the vehicle see around blind corners, as an example. That could be one, but it really has to be as little as possible.
Yeah, Luminar intersections, you know, whatever can help, I think makes sense. Why not? But as you just said, it shouldn't be mandatory. And besides, we don't have enough. I mean, we don't have any commercial deployments. So right now we're just guessing.
Jason, is Luminar manufacturing or working with any partners where you're putting LiDAR on infrastructure?
Yes. Yeah, so we work with people who've looked at deploying onto infrastructure for various applications. I think there are use cases for that or valuable things. We call that our adjacent market team. We go after those adjacent markets where the technology can help in that in terms of infrastructure. But I think what it really comes down to is you look at the deployment, the decision isn't going to be whether you're doing things to the infrastructure. It's going to come down to operating domain. If you operate on highways only, you can, for the first time, give a consumer a driver out of the loop operation. And that's really how we look at autonomy. There's driver in the loop, and this is where our proactive safety and things are done to help make the driving experience safer. And there's true driver out of the loop. The driver's taking a nap, the driver's watching a movie, which, by the way, they're doing today. But they're doing that in a safe way where the car takes responsibility for the driving. And you can do that in the next couple of years if you geofence and restrict to a highway environment. If you try to go into an urban environment, it gets a lot longer time periods for deployment, especially to consumers.
Are you alluding to your partnership with Volvo?
So yeah, that's just one of many partnerships we have, but Volvo for sure and their highway pilot, I mean, they are absolutely focused on safety. There's no company in the world that's more focused on automotive safety than Volvo. And so they see the value in the Luminar technology to go enable highway autonomy. And I think that speaks volumes for the level of performance we have. And I think over time, as more and more companies struggle with actual deployment of what they say is autonomy, but really is level 2-ish, and that's the problem I have with the SAE standards. When they say level 2+, it's still driver in the loop operation, but you're limited in the performance or the efficacy, specifically because of the performance of the sensors. I think over time, people realize you need the highest performance sensors. And when they realize they can have higher performance sensors at the same cost as the sensors they have today, as we grow and scale our volumes, it'll be a game changer.
It's a complete game changer. And Volvo has a long history of safety, going back to I remember when the doors opened like this, and there's all the ads, and the kid was sitting in the back seat, and it was safe. Carter, you're going to have a big challenge. So Cruise built the Origin. It's getting ready to roll off the line. How are you going to convince the public or build a trust with the public that, yes, when you ride on the Origin, it is a safe vehicle that will get you to and from your destination safely?
Well, I mean, there's two things there. There's, of course, the fact of autonomy, and there's also the unique form factor, right? So I think when it comes to autonomy, you know, I've ridden in several of our vehicles in the past, and they received the highest rating that I could give them, which was it was super boring after the first 2 minutes. You know, you thought, well, I'm just on a road again. I guess I'm going wherever I'm going. And so I think there's that first step. It'll be like any technology. You'll have early adopters, and then you'll get your mom on it, then your grandfather, and all of a sudden the whole family's riding AVs wherever they go, and having more time to do, you know, whatever it is they do in the car. The next step, the form factor of the Origin, I think, is interesting because there's no windshield, right? You're not looking at the windshield. There is no steering wheel for you to grab. It's like when I'm on an airplane, I fly all the time. I have a crippling fear of flying, and I always imagine, surely if something really went wrong, I could go grab the controls and sort of turn this thing around. So I'm sure folks will feel uncomfortable, perhaps, that there is not that familiar equipment inside of a vehicle, but we've seen it with all kind of technology, from airplanes that fly themselves most of the way across the Atlantic, to the driver assistance systems, to iPhones. Whatever it is, it feels uncomfortable at first, and humans are so adaptable. I think pretty quickly they figure out if the product is good and it's designed around human beings, adoption is usually pretty swift.
Will you put a slot machine in there for me?
For you?
Yeah, I want to gamble in there.
Of course.
Thank you. We're on to something here. Joseph, how is Perrone building that trust when you deploy for your customers and local communities?
Sure. So a lot of it would be what I was, I think, saying at the beginning, is that initial outreach before the vehicle is even deployed. I think getting the community involved, and whether we have to do kind of roundtables or stand-up events, I mean, we're happy to do that. Yeah, there should just be no question marks when that vehicle